Guys, another game where at first defense was really in question, and then eventually it turned into, I think, the defensive stalemate that at least many projected. That's Georgia knocking off South Carolina 24-14. This first half was depressing if you were a Georgia fan. The offense couldn't move the ball. The defense couldn't stop a nosebleed. Spencer Rattler goes 8 for 8 on the opening drive and a touchdown pass, just marches down the field. Now, South Carolina lost Juice Wells on that first drive. A broken bone in his foot is what Shane Beamer told us in between the first and the second quarter in his interview. But this will bleed, I think, into the discussion of, hey, who is actually good this year in college football? But Garrett, that Georgia defense looked like they showed up in house shoes and pajama bottoms. They were not ready to play.
Oh, they're getting out physical for a little while, and you look at some of those first couple drives, it didn't look like anybody came to play. And I mean, look, at the end of the day, if you're Georgia, you want the win, right? We talk about it, and I've said this multiple times. I'll say this a couple times tonight, but you get a bad game if you're a team like Georgia, if you're a team that's trying to compete at the very, very top. You get one bad game where you don't really show up to play, you don't really show up with your best stuff. This might be Georgia's one, right? This might be the one where they get to show up, and the Gamecocks tend to give them a problem. Whatever, they did the same thing with Missouri last year. They went on and won the national championship. So, look, maybe this is how it goes from this year. But I mean, I wasn't crazy impressed with the product on the field. Pulling up some of these stats real quick, you look, Carson Beck, not necessarily convincing, not a poor day necessarily. 27-35, 269, no touchdowns. The running backs kind of took care of business. I think 3 rushing touchdowns in this game by different backs. Edwards kind of led the way in the yardage. But, I think you just really have to look at this and say, if you're Georgia, why do you feel good about this game? This is the South Carolina team that just a couple weeks ago, got kind of smacked around by North Carolina, gave up a whole bunch of sacks, really got, destroyed up front. And you can do very much for a while. There was a lot of struggling up front, a lot of struggling in the line of scrimmage for a while. If you can't do that against the South Carolina team with no offensive line, what happens when you play Missouri this year, right? A Missouri team that went out and played physical against the Kansas State team. What happens if you go and play Florida, who impressed us tonight? I think there's a lot of questions if you're a Georgia fan tonight. And I think that, obviously across this country is going to be several questions for a lot of these big teams, but Georgia's certainly not without their questions.
Trey, the Bulldogs initially couldn't stop Spencer Rattler, but his line, he finishes 22 of 42, 256 yards, a touchdown, and 2 picks. Now, listen, I don't really fault him for those 2 picks. He had to force the ball late. The offense couldn't move anything. For me, I look at the 53 yards rushing. That was all that they got, despite pushing the Bulldogs around in the first half. It really was a tale of 2 halves where Georgia just completely bowed up, did not allow anything to get through in the second half. Tell me this. Do you feel like South Carolina has something this year that they can still be a dangerous team, or do you think that Georgia was just asleep at the wheel here in the first half? Because in the second half, it looked like South Carolina couldn't do anything to save their lives.
Yeah, and I mean, Georgia's a great team that's going to make halftime adjustments because they have a fantastic coaching staff, and they took away what Spencer Rattler was, exploiting in the first half. South Carolina had a fantastic game plan in the first half. They were getting guys open. Their route concepts were fantastic. I'm thinking, towards the end of the first half when they scored to go up 14-3 at that point, it wasn't a touchdown, but it was a play that got them right on the doorstep. It was just a beautiful route concept where they hid the inside receiver wide open. Just Georgia had no answer for that. But they have a fantastic coaching staff that makes adjustments. And right out of the gate in the second half, you saw the fruit of that, right? Georgia just takes over the game. They score 2 touchdowns really quickly. They scored 21 unanswered in the second half, and that's all she wrote. So I think South Carolina has the talent to scare a lot of teams this year. I think that they can jump up and get somebody on any given week, really. We've seen our running theme today is going to be that we don't think the SEC has any dominant teams maybe outside of Athens, Georgia. And that's going to mean a team like South Carolina can certainly jump up and get somebody that preseason we didn't think they were supposed to. So I came away encouraged by South Carolina. The second half was definitely disappointing if you're a fan of the Gamecocks, but Spencer Rattler's having a great year so far. He is, exceeding expectations, and that's all you can really ask for. If you have a quarterback that's exceeding expectations, playing really well, you're going to win a lot of football games. And I think South Carolina fans can be encouraged by that. They have a brutal schedule like they do every year. The schedule's going to be really tough. They still have Clemson at the end of the year. They still have pretty much their full SEC East schedule. But, I'm leaning more towards them making a bowl game now after these first 3 weeks than I was before the season, and maybe making a nicer bowl game than they have in the past. So, but back on Georgia real quick, if we can for a second, guys. This is concerning to me because we've toyed around with, should we discuss the slow offensive starts for the Georgia Bulldogs? We've brought that up the last 2 weeks in our show prep for our recap shows. And we've decided not to really mention it. We've mentioned it here and there. We mentioned it in our preview for South Carolina, but this is now 3 for 3 extremely slow starts for the Georgia offense. And I think they have, I don't know if it's a game planning problem. I don't know if it's an offensive coordinator problem, but they are missing Todd Monken right now. I think that is very, very clear. Mike Bobo, that something is missing with what's going on there in Athens on the offensive side of the ball. I know they lost a lot. I know they lost a 4-year starter at quarterback. I know Carson Beck is learning on the job right now, and that's going to be a lot of growing pains, but it just seems like something is missing, does it not?
It feels like very reminiscent of what we've seen the last couple of years in College Station, right?
Yes.
Where the play calling does not seem to be built around the personnel that the Bulldogs have. The reads are just happening so slowly. And I don't know if that's a Carson Beck problem. I don't know if that's a route tree problem where, that was certainly the case with Jimbo's offense, where it didn't matter where Haynes King or Kellen Mond was looking. By the time that route was supposed to be breaking open, there was pressure breathing down the quarterback's neck, right? And that was the case early on in the first half, where it felt like Beck didn't know where to go with the football. He was always under pressure. He was having to force the ball into tight windows. I agree. I think Georgia has a Mike Bobo problem. I think very similar to what we're about to talk about with Alabama. I think a team's struggles at sometimes can be directly correlated with the quality of the coordinator. And we've obviously talked about that with a couple of teams this year, but for me, it's a Mike Bobo problem.
Yeah, I think you have to look at this and say that it is a Mike Bobo problem. It comes down to the fact that when you're Georgia, you're going to have the players, you're going to have the athletes, but you have to know where to put them. And when you have a young quarterback, you have to put them in a position to win. When you have a quarterback that hasn't played that many games, who hasn't, started in the big time, you're not going to be able to get away with stuff that maybe you previously have been able to. Obviously, I know with Stetson Bennett, it was a different situation, but you had a guy in Stetson Bennett the last couple of years that if things were struggling, you could kind of count on him to be the leader, to be the guy who's been around, who's played in the big games to overcome those problems. You can't count on that with Carson Beck. He hasn't played that level of football yet. This is conference game number 1, right? And so you have to make sure that you're putting him in situations to win. You're giving him easy reads. You're giving him what he can handle. And if he can't handle it, then you have to make sure that you're putting him in a position to win his way, right? To hand the ball off to the backs, to, establish the run, to dominate on defense, right? And if you're not going to do any of those things, you're going to struggle long term.
Gracious, how about